Board of Directors. This is a special meeting on February 17th, 2021. It is 6:34. Could we have a roll call, please?
Okay. Director Boyd?
Here.
Director Harvey?
Here.
Director Lohman?
Here.
Director Slater-Carter?
Present.
And Director Decker is not present.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let me do a brief president's statement. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. This is a great crowd. So glad to see you all here, and many familiar names and faces. So really happy to have you. We're looking forward to what we're going to do tonight. So first, we're gonna have a presentation, and we'll ask you during the presentation if you have questions to put them into the chat. Allison will cover some of the details of how one does that if you're not familiar. And then after the presentation, we'll go to questions in sequence. Allison will take care of walking us through that. And if, well, I'll let Allison talk about some of the logistics on how we get through that, but she'll be keeping an eye out for raised hands and questions and acknowledging you, so you can know, you can put your hand down and we've got your question, and we'll come to it in sequence. Then after members of the public have a chance to get through their questions, then we'll go to the board for a little bit of discussion, maybe a few more questions, and that'll wrap up our meeting. So we're not anticipating a very long meeting tonight, but we do have a good presentation that we want to start with. And again, thank you so much for being here. We're really eager to hear your questions and your feedback. This is all part of our plan. Our planning process, and getting your involvement is really key to that. So welcome and thank you for being here. With that, this is a board meeting. So do we have any comments from members of the public on items that are not on the agenda? And I am not seeing hands raised, so I'm going to take that as a no. And if we miss you, we can try to double back later if something comes to mind. All right, we have no old business, only new business, and this is a strategic discussion about sewer treatment and environmental protection. And with that, let me turn it to Clemens.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I'm going to actually let Allison introduce how to share this really with how share comments, for example. So Allison, if you can just start the presentation, and I'm going to take over in just a couple of slides here.
Yes. Give me 2 seconds just to get everybody up. I want to make sure I can see participants and see the chat screen. Once again, as I get in here, you should see a chat message right now. So I'm going to move us forward here. This is a sewer environmental protection discussion, intended to be a discussion, so please ask questions. In case you are not familiar with how to do this, we are basically asking you to use chat to chat a question during the presentation to me. I will strive, if you will focus on me, Allison, to send your questions to. I will help Clemens to insert them or ask them. Right now, I don't see anyone on by phone, which is good. So in case you haven't seen this, you should be able to find chat there at the bottom and just send the message to me, Allison, as the host. So with that, I think I welcome everyone. I really appreciate people being here tonight. And what some of you may recall, and I understand I wasn't with the district at that time, I'm basically assisting with this effort. I know that there was a strategic planning effort previously, which had a great result. It produced the mission statement, the values for the district, and a strategic plan. And that is currently in use and part of what is guiding what is a more specific discussion tonight on the sewer system and the environmental protection element of that. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Clemens.
Thank you, Allison. All right, well, so my name is Clemens Heldmeyer. I'm the general manager of the Montara Water and Sanitary District. I'm since 2002 with the agency and managed the agency since 2008. And I want to say that it's a lot of fun working for this local body that has really some decision power for the community. And I think it was uh, a good idea to form this agency in 1958. The agency was formed really as a result from the need to treat sewage in the community. There was an effort by the county actually to implement a solution for that, but the community decided that they can do this a little bit cheaper and better, and that worked out great. For example, shortly after the formation of the district, the county dump site was supposed to go into what we know as Graywell Cove, and this district prevented it. So just imagine how different our coast side would look like if the Graywell Cove Valley would be now full it would be the local dump, and would be kind of an environmental nightmare, I bet. So so we're delivering here the critical services with a focus on affordability and serve our community's unique need. The garbage function came really with the sewer function as well. And on the water side, in 2003, we acquired the privately owned and managed water system. So today, every day, we deliver drinking water to our 1,600 connections, over 1,600 connections here in the coastal community from Montara to Moss Beach. Next slide. So this is a brief board and staff overview. And you see the board members here tonight. They will participate in the discussion later. You see we have a total of 8 employees with limited admin staff. Sonia, you might know her. She is focusing on water billing. Tracy, our district clerk, is here also tonight. I'm the general manager one more time. And then you know our water system operators, probably from driving around every day and taking care of the system. I was asked by the board last week at a meeting, or 2 weeks at a meeting, to mention an award that we just recently got. We have gotten this award now almost every year for our safe working conditions. Had a long stretch without any accidents, and that's what we've been rewarded with. Also want to mention that we are, as far as I know, the only public agency on the coast side that wasn't hit by COVID yet. And I think there's a lot of luck that goes along with that, but I also want to thank our staff members for taking the care that's needed to do that. What we don't show here on the slide is the SAM staff. The Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side staff is actually taking care of our collection system. So the district made the decision, instead of hiring sewer staff to maintain our sewer system that we own, we have a contract with the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side and utilize the SAM staff. That's also doing an outstanding job, and you probably know some of them from just seeing them in the community. Next slide, please. So I think it's really neat to take a look actually at an enclosed water cycle. Because from the water collection and the distribution to the sewage collection, treatment and discharge, we locally manage every step of the water cycle. And this is really a unique benefit to our community. We're really close to the ocean, and that really makes for very confined aquifers. So we get the precipitation onto Montara Mountain, and from there it drains essentially towards the ocean, and we see this in various different aquifers. So as we proceed in this discussion, you will see where we may want to take further action locally to manage our water. Next slide. Okay, so this is what we're doing tonight. I'll provide an overview of our system and history along with the regulatory controls that we have to follow. And I'll also overview some considerations that we have to think about for the next 10 to 50 years, and we better start thinking about them now. Next slide. So this presentation is about the sewer side. We have on the water side a presentation scheduled, similar outlook. That's on March 3rd, also at 6:30. I hope you can participate in this as well. Let's start with the basics of our sewer um, system and what we have to do. Of course, all waste that leaves homes, toilets, showers, sinks, dishwashers, clothes washers, everything must receive some type of treatment to protect the public health and the environment. And we're really regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act that's intended to protect our health and the environment from sanitary sewage and other pollutants. And there's a number of agencies that look over our shoulder that we adhere to the rules and regulations, how to do that. Next slide. So, all right, this is our, so sewage management. What do we need to do here? Sewage treatment requires first the collection, so collection system, separation, treatment, and then discharge and disposal. So wastewater treatment really separates the solids from the liquids and makes both inert, and that ensures that no diseases or pathogens remain to harm other organisms. Couple of terms that we may want to use later in the discussion. We distinguish between primary treatment, that will be the removal of floatables, trash, the settling of solids. We talk about secondary treatment, that is the treatment that our sewage currently receives. That's now added to the primary treatment, a biological process. That's a further separation of solids from water, chemical treatment of the water to kill pathogens, biological treatment of solid waste to kill the pathogens as well. And then we're getting into tertiary treatment. That's where we're approaching the recycled water, the reuse. That's the highest level of treatment of water and the effluent. And so that can enable really the reuse for the water reuse for irrigation up to potentially potable or drinking water use. And we'll look at that in more detail. Next slide. Today, we collect sewage through 24 miles of gravity flow sewers, along with 3 miles of pressurized sewers. We have 13 major pump stations and 21 smaller pump stations. And so this is a rather complicated system. I always like to mention that our sister agencies, the Granada Community Services District and the city of Half Moon Bay, don't have really this complication. They have a much more bowl-shaped topography, and sewage can be brought to the plant or to the SAM collection system by gravity. That's not the case here in the district. It's rather complicated and also energy intensive due to the coastal topography. So also just want to briefly mention, we offered treatment here in the district. That plant had to be removed. We'll also talk about that in a couple of slides, but that space today provides extra storage for flow equalization, for example, for wet weather events or plant maintenance, or like we've seen it recently, where the plant was only able to handle the flows from the city of Half Moon Bay. The city can't hold the sewage back, so the sewage was held back from Montara and Granada so that the treatment plant wasn't overwhelmed. The next slide, please. Okay, so the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side. So that is the treatment plant that treats all sewage and wastewater for the Montara Water and Sanitary District, Granada Community Services District, and Half Moon Bay. So it's a joint powers authority that is created by the 3 agencies entering an agreement. So wastewater treatment plants like the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side, secondary treatment plant, they really use microorganisms to eat the human waste. And in order for these bugs to survive, the plant provides food. That's the liquid, the solid sewage that's being sent down. Heat is produced through this, and oxygen is also uh, a part of the process that is added. So it's really important to keep this living organisms, all these bugs, alive. Otherwise, the plant has to go offline. The current plant was built between 1979 and 1983 and is in need of significant ongoing maintenance and investment. The treated wastewater is discharged to the Pacific Ocean. That's really the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary. That's the waters from Monterey all the way up to the Golden Gate. And that's done through what we call an ocean outfall. It's a discharge pipe. At the end is a submerged diffuser. It's going out approximately 2,000 feet from the shore and is about 37 feet deep out in the ocean. Next slide. So here we see the SAM collection system. The intertie pipeline system is shown here in green and yellow. So SAM now collects and treats the sewage from Montara all the way south to Half Moon Bay. So all of our community's sewage travels south for treatment. I want to mention Half Moon Bay is not fully pictured here, but SAM provides the treatment for the entire city. Next slide. Okay, so here's a bit a timeline. I just mentioned we were formed in 1958. So in the 60s, MWSD successfully built and operated a brand new secondary treatment plant. So that was at the time state of the art, and also an ocean discharge here in Montara. So we still actually have an ocean outfall in place here in Montara. And at the time the plant met all state and federal requirements, it was permitted by the regulating agencies. However, the 70s was a period where centralized treatment plants were preferred. That was the idea of the day, to reduce the number of treatment plants. And so it's really interesting that there was an active look to figure out how to get to a centralized treatment plant. Granada and Half Moon Bay had failing treatment plants. Again, Montara had a brand new treatment plant. And what really happened was that the boundaries of the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve were modified and extended to encompass our ocean outfall. And that put Montara water, back then it was Montara Sanitary District, immediately into violation. And Montara was forced to abandon the plant. Plant was not even paid off, and enter into the SAM agreement and pay a second time for treatment plant. Another important date here is, I think, the 2017 date. The city of Half Moon Bay filed a lawsuit, and we're going to look at that at the next slide. So the SAM contract really outlines the conveyance, treatment, and discharge assets that were built to serve our combined communities. Now, in 2017, the city filed a lawsuit that really seeks to free the city from the cost of maintaining the critical shared pipeline that ties our communities together. So they filed a lawsuit against Montara Water and Sanitary District, Granada Community Services District, as well as the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side. Remember, they own 50% of the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side, essentially suing themselves. We believe the contract is clear, and Half Moon Bay is obligated to pay their share of this asset. Next slide. And what I actually still need to say about the slide above is that this is an ongoing lawsuit, so we'll we'll learn more how this evolves and develops and what the outcome will be. So whatever direction we are going to take may look in the coming years, we will have to comply with federal and state regulations and obtain permits to operate. So here's a snapshot of the various legislation and regulators that oversee any system that we going to choose to maintain or build. Next slide, please. So let's get a little bit into the discussion, into the topic that we want to really introduce tonight. So as we look into the next 10 to 50 years, there are a number of things to consider. And I'll review all of those or a few of those in further detail in the coming slides. The presentation doesn't delve deeply into the age of our sewer system assets, but it's really a key driver to our discussion tonight. So over the next 10 to 50 years, our collection and treatment systems will need significant investment. Just as any homeowner facing a new roof or a major repair of their home will look at the opportunity and cost of other renovations that could occur, we also need to look at the cost and opportunity that come when we address needed infrastructure investment. Next slide. So climate change considerations. So with that forward look, climate change may cause impacts to our current sewer system. Specifically sea level rise. Sea level rise means also, at least close to the ocean, groundwater level rise. And that may mean that the sand plant must move inland. So the location of the plant may be unsuitable for the future. Climate change may also impact our water supplies, and we're going to talk about this also in detail on March 3rd. It may also force the greater need for alternative water supplies, and we're talking here about recycled water. Next slide. So with that forward look, we have to be aware that the state of California has already had legislative proposals to require zero discharge from sewage plants. Some proposals even have suggested 100% recycling. And I think that is really interesting because as we show later, 100% recycling is technically absolutely, it's not feasible. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to what it means to recycle water. 100% recycling is, as I stated, impossible. So regardless, we have to consider the potential for legislative changes or changes to our permitting, and that very soon, potentially. Next slide. So what are we going to do if there is no ocean outfall allowed? Alternatives could be effluent polishing retention ponds, for example. So we have options, both to address these potential changes and to potentially provide additional benefits right here in the community. So, for example, what if we use the natural processes to further polish and treat our effluent, use it here in the district? There's some pictures here from Las Galinas Sanitary District in San Rafael, and that's Mount View Sanitary District in Martinez. And they work with some of these ponds, and they serve as a great community resource as well. So there's partially a public park use possible, education for science destination for classes. There is annual Audubon bird counts, so there's bird habitat here as well. Next slide. So here is one example. So what we call package plants are essentially viable options for different sewage treatment. So there's plants that could provide the level of treatment we desire in our community. It's something that you can essentially purchase in modules, put together, and use here. And what's really interesting here is, I mean, this could allow for groundwater recharge, marsh or creek recharge, for example. Those are environmental benefits. Next slide. So when we look at considering recycled water, let's take a look at what's allowed in California right now. So let's go to the next slide, Allison. No, that one. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Recycled water considerations, sorry.
No, yes,
The one prior? This
yes,
one?
this one, please. Exactly. So
Slip.
let's stay on this one just a bit, because the state has indicated that it will issue new regulations allowing surface water augmentation. That means putting recycled water into reservoirs, or even direct potable use. But I want to caution everyone that it's not as simple. We all saw Bill Gates take a swig of recycled water, and it's not as simple as simply overcoming the notion that what you drink is coming directly from a sewer plant. There's a number of contaminants that are very difficult to remove, even with recycled water process, even with the tertiary processes, for example, hormones. So it's something that was discussed, and I think a lot of folks had hopes that this will happen very soon. I think we're actually far away from this at this point. Next slide. So then again, we have to consider a number of things. So we need sewage to produce the recycled water. Do we recycle at the current sewer authority mid-coast plant, or do we recycle within our community? What's the end use of the recycled water? Paying customer sounds like a great idea, but it's also not as straightforward as one would think. With paying customers, we're mainly talking about irrigation, and irrigation is used in the summertime, or mostly needed in the summertime, with the wet weather flows that every sewer system receives. The highest recycled water flows are in the wintertime. So what are we going to do, for example, then during the wintertime with this water? Also, recycled water, what we also have to think about is it comes with a cost. There's a lot of energy that goes into it, a high carbon footprint, and then there is byproduct considerations. And we're going to look at this specifically because I think that's important also to understand. Next slide. So we're producing around 200,000 gallons of dry weather sewage that's suitable for one of these packaged plants that we just mentioned. And so when we consider such a system, we have to look to address our current and future needs and think about the potential benefits. So we have to make sure that we first treat the sewage that we generate. We have to have a discharge location and a disposal plan, right? And we have to consider how we best manage our local resources wisely. So there is opportunities for benefits depending on the choices we make. But whatever we do, we'll spend money on this, regardless of the configuration we have, or if we use the configuration we have currently, or if we're going to make changes. So the question really is, are we looking now for something that could benefit this community when it comes to recycled water? Next slide, please. So as a reminder, when we plan, we have to always keep in mind that we have to have an effluent discharge solution for, when we talk about recycled water, we need also an effluent discharge solution, however that looks like. We have to have also a solids solution. We have to figure out what happens to the solids that get ultimately dried and usually trucked away. But what's really important to understand is that we can't recycle 100% of our sewage. So there's a third product that really comes out of that process, That's called brine. And we have to have a solution for that brine. How do we dispose of that brine if this agency or sewer authority mid-coast side moves forward with recycled water? Next slide. So this is what we're doing today. So we're trying to look at this schematically, right? Today, we, along with Granada and Half Moon Bay, send all of our sewage to the SAM plant, where the treated solids are trucked to the landfill and the treated effluent is discharged to the ocean. And Montara's flow of this is roughly 20%. That reflects our ownership in the sewer authority mid-coast side as well. Granada's flows are also around 20%. Half Moon Bay's flows are roughly 60%. Granada owns 30% of the plant. Half Moon Bay owns 50% of the plant. Next slide, please. So if the SAM plant needs reconstruction or even relocation, perhaps Montara and Granada build their own plant and utilize the IPS for treated effluent to transport to the existing discharge location. So you're looking really at now the gray arrows sending the treated effluent to the existing ocean outfall, right? That would then mean that we still need a solution for the solids, and we need to think about what can we do with the effluent recycled water. So do we do full treatment, manage solids, recycled water only? So we're just posing some questions here, really. Next slide. So this is another scenario that we can envision. Do we build and operate our own treatment plant and utilize or revitalize our ocean discharge? The pipe would have to be extended to avoid the marine reserve, for example. We still have to address solid and effluent disposal. Do we create local treatment that does not require an ocean discharge location? It's also an option. Next slide. So regardless, all of these configurations should be considered, and elements could be adjusted based on the consideration and on your input tonight, further input from the community. Of course, cost and feasibility play a major role in this as well. Next slide. So this is a look at the watersheds in our community, and I spoke about that a little bit at the beginning when we looked at the water cycle. It's not only in our community, we added some to the south. So those of our neighboring Granada Community Services District, some of those, Denniston and Deer Creek, for example, and that's also Coastside County Water District territory. So, but if we look here, we don't like really places where we could beneficially reuse highly treated effluent. When I look at one of these aquifers, I really like that it's so confined. So you have very good control. You could, for example, recharge groundwater into one of these aquifers, and then through wells further closer to the ocean. Then after the recycled water spent some time in the aquifer, some years in the aquifer, and is much more in the natural environment, it could be utilized as potable drinking water. For example, the Montara Creek watershed is a watershed that we're using right now. It's one of the watersheds that we're using right now extensively to provide drinking water. Next slide. So this is a look at the northern section, and we're looking here at those watersheds along with the creeks, marshes, open spaces. We're looking really there. We're seeing some options. Just pointing out there is some options for recycled water or alternative effluent management. And, as district, we look to be aware of and consider options within our community, of course. And that's why you can understand why we look at properties for purchase or acquisition, for example. So here we're just noting where these elements are in our community. Many of them are privately owned, and we don't know if they are interested in receiving recycled water or if they're available even for location of some of those facilities. Next slide. So this is the southern portion, and again, whatever we do, there will be costs to maintain sewage collection and treatment for the coast side. Whatever we do, many millions will need to be spent in the future. Next slide. So as I'm closing the presentation, please understand that this is a process that will take time. So with your thoughts tonight, the district, the board will consider further action to take, and whatever direction is taken, further more detailed study of engineering, feasibility, hydraulics, construction, and cost will need to be taken into consideration before we make any decisions here. And so we anticipate that we'll bring further studies to the board, so we expect this is to be quite a lengthy process that we don't want to rush through this. Next slide. So I'm going to return to our well thought out mission statement. That was actually our first slide. You may have taken a look at that. So we look to manage fully and wisely our natural resources on full water cycle. We provide reliable, high quality services at equitable prices and ensure vitality for future generations. I wanted to thank everyone here for helping us to explore our community's opportunities. I want to point out that we have our sewer engineer, Pipin Cavagnaro, here. Also, our water engineer, Tanya Jurovsky, is here as well. So this is really where water and sewer meet a little bit. Again, we have a March 3 presentation specifically about the future of the water system and how we see this. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Allison. Maybe Allison, you can one more time explain how the process works, how we want to receive comments, and then we can dive into a discussion.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yes, so if you want to chat a question to me, I will be happy to verbalize it and ask the appropriate expert, whether that's Clemens or Clemens to the engineers. I think if you raise your hand as well, I'm more than willing to call on members and help get some questions and discussion here. And the one thing I would note is, I know we had one question about, there was a lot of discussion of brine in some of the early recycled water as a byproduct, and it didn't indicate, none of the diagrams when we were showing the current treatment or the combined, the northern treatment and the SAM plant, it wasn't clear where that brine might go. So Clemens, I know we've spoken about this, that ultimately, yeah, go ahead.
One of the options would be, for example, that we utilize the existing IPS that could then be actually bypassing the treatment plant, but utilizing the ocean outfall, for example. Right, that would be one option for the brine.
Great. Great. I know we also had a question, can recycled water be stored and used for, say, firefighting in the community?
Well, yes, it could be. But I want to point out that we see around sewage flows of around 200,000 gallons. That's dry weather flow. So it can be many times more during wet weather periods. Usual storage tanks. So we, for example, have roughly, what is it, like Tanya, 1.3, 1.6 million gallons of storage of drinking water in the community.
Yes, 1.6.
So, 1.6, thank you. So if you then envision, this, if we build a 1 million gallon storage tank for exclusively fire protection, you have a lot of water sitting there. And that is essentially 3-4 days of flows. then you need a system that is separate from our potable water system to deliver the water to fire, to to whatever you need to protect. So it's doable, it's feasible, but you need a very unique situation. Building a full distribution system for recycled water is very expensive. Pipes cost currently around, laying pipe costs currently around $400 per foot. So it's really cost prohibitive to build a distribution system for recycled water for this purpose.
Okay, I have a couple other questions. So I'm going to go to one that's on recycled water since we were just speaking about it, and then come back to another legislative question. So the question is, we've mentioned that recycled water is, you can't do 100% recycled water of all of your sewage. Could you explain the difference between the technical processing and the policy definition of 100% recycled water? I believe there are two definitions. The two definitions may differ. I do know that when we've talked about legislation, some of the legislation was zero discharge, but some was also originally proposed as 100% recycling. So I don't know if we have a perfect answer, but Clement?
Well, let's. I'm going to see if Pippin can give us the best answer on this. Our sewer engineer.
Thank you, Clemens.
Yep.
I think Allison kind of hit the key elements there. The regulators don't have a clear picture, a clear definition on all the processes when they use this language. It's kind of, I kind of liken it to those folks that stood up and said, we just need to scrub the carbon dioxide out of the exhaust of a coal-fired power plant. And it sounds good when a politician says that, but it's physically impossible to do that, because that's the process of burning fossil fuel, is you create carbon dioxide. So in the context of recycled water, when you have a zero discharge, there are 100%, you could have various different reuses if you have enough space. When you have ponds, you get evaporation. So that'll reduce some of the flow depending on your environment. Hotter climates, Israel and some of these hotter climates that do this, they can just evaporate some of their brine in evaporation ponds. I think Mexico, they do that in some locations. And so that extra water would just evaporate into the atmosphere, and they just have a salt left in the bottom of the pond. That really isn't feasible in this community. And then, as Clemens pointed out, there's different, we call it tertiary treatment, and Tanya can go into more details if there's specific water treatment questions, but there is, different types of levels of treatment for recycled water. So whether you're going for agricultural, up here in Marin County, Las Colinas does have a zero discharge for part of the year, and they use those ponds, and they also irrigate like alfalfa fields, for example. But the winter flows, they do have to chemically treat a portion of that sewage in the conventional way and put it out into a discharge path into the ocean. So it is, in the details, it can be, it's hard to show every arrow on a schematic. Ultimately, in the general concept, if you have good potable, or good recycled water that's useful in the community, the extra brine would generally just get combined with the other treated sewage and put out in the current or in some kind of an ocean discharge.
Thank you. I know that the other question was more on legislation. So it said, it didn't hear, we didn't mention AB Assembly Bill 377, which I believe, this is Greg asked this question, so if we need clarification, but we're trying to figure out if is it an imminent bill? Understand that it requires waterways to be compliant regardless of whether a point effluent is identified. So Pippin, is that something you're familiar with?
To be honest, I'd have to do a little bit more research to answer it in the context of this discussion. There are lots of, when we get deeper into looking at feasibility of different types of options, there are lots and lots of details to consider. When Clemens mentioned a solution for how the recycled water would work, what goes along with that are various alternatives. As he pointed out, different times of the year, different amounts of water are produced, and they can't all go to the same sources. And when you apply those waters, say, for example, if you wanted to do surface creek injection, which the state is looking at as a possibility, that's looked at extremely carefully and closely. For example, everything, even the temperature of the water has to, be very, very close to the ambient temperature within a very tight tolerance. Because if you put warm water into the creek, that's going to change the plants and the animals, maybe promoting some less healthy ones for the local creek. So each as solutions are considered, then we'd have to dig deeper into which specific assembly bills are present at the time, but more specifically, getting a biological research team on board to help prepare a study to prepare, go through the CEQA alternatives that would be suitable. When I say CEQA, I mean California Environmental Quality Act requirements.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions I've seen in the chat. So I'm wondering if anyone has particularly thoughts on some of these ideas. Is recycled water something that the community would like to see? Is it important? I mean, whether that's for an ag use or whether that might be more for an environmental use. Certainly I know the district is in a situation now with a system that functions. So I think the question is always, is that the scenario moving forward that people want to see? Will that work best for the community in 50 years? So I don't know if anyone wants to raise a hand or ask another question. And here's, okay, Anne has a question. So I'm going to ask Anne to unmute, and then I see TJ does as well. So Anne, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. As far as going forward, it sounds like the plan is primarily for the situation you have now, but there is significant build out that is going to occur. And have you taken that into consideration? And how does that compare to the options that are being put forth right now?
Well, I mean, currently, when it comes to the growth in the community, this is all very regulated and organized. So there's a 1% growth limit that is set through the planning agencies. And what I can say is that this agency doesn't have a problem supplying this 1% per year for the foreseeable future. And there's a number of mechanisms in place that actually require us to amend, for example, on the water side, to look for more sources if we would ever get close to running out. So there is no running out of capacity that we really see in the current scenario. So any project that is approved from the planning agencies can and must be served by this agency. And I hope this answers this at least a little bit, Anne.
Great, thank you. And TJ, if you want to unmute.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for convening this session and kind of going through the history and these long-term options that are really important for the group to think through and for the community to be part of. I'm confused though about the short term versus the long term. A lot of these issues, the recycling and the like, and are very long-term, it seems to me. And my understanding is that we're faced with some very serious short-term problems, that the sand plant is really in serious need of repair. We've got significant costs ahead of us in terms of our collection and distribution system, whatever the right words are for that. Is so subject to the lawsuit. However the lawsuit comes out, we've all got a lot of costs that are going to have to be borne in dealing with that. How should I think about the short term in the context of also these long-term discussions? And what are we doing to kind of get our arms around the short-term issue?
So the short-term issue is essentially something where I think we all agree it needs to be addressed. So I don't think we're talking about really getting out of the current setup with the sewer authority mid-coast side within the next 10 years. We understand that alone for that period, there's some significant investments needed. So we know we have to spend some significant money now to keep the plant up and running for the short to mid-term. But we understand that, you know, the mid and long-term options for this plant may look completely different. So I hope this is, I mean, this some sort of a conflict when I say this. We have to spend now some money, and we are aware of this, but we may have to spend even more money in the midterm, and we're thinking through, does it make sense to, you know, maybe focus already on different solutions, and that would help us then make decisions on really, you know, how much do we now invest into the existing system, and how much do we build up a new scenario?
Clemens, if I might, I would just say thank you, TJ, for the question. This is precisely the thing that led us to this point where we're having this public discussion. We know we have to spend, and by being very aware of the kind of spending that we have over the coming years to support the kind of the status quo approach that we have, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that if you're going to have to spend this kind of money, and we do believe the needs are there, it's been starved for a long time for a lot of reasons, but here we are, we're looking at understanding our future spend pretty clearly. Could we spend some or all of that money in a different way that gives us a better result? And so that's why we want to put this in front of the community, because we do think there are some possibilities that are very definitely worth considering. And we want to involve you all in in understanding the challenge and the opportunity that this presents.
I know we had another question that came in through chat, which was more related to current legislative and regulatory changes or actions, proposed changes, and how we track them. I know that the California Special District Association tracks the Association of California Water Districts. They both represent a certain side and certainly a valuable watchdog effort on behalf of districts like Montara, but and of course the consultants as well, because this is the industry. So that's one question for you, Clemens, and then I know we have two hands raised as soon as you get a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I think you almost answered it. Of course, we have also our legal counsel who's also in attendance, who's monitoring all of these changes as well. So we're member in various organizations that essentially inform us about changes, potential changes within the industry, and so that's really how all the agencies keep track of potential legislative changes.
Great, thank you. Okay, I know I have Greg and Harold, so I'm going to go to Greg first. So Greg, if you can unmute, you'll be able to, yeah.
So putting on my MCC hat, I'm wondering how we get this message out to the rest of the community. Is GCSD doing this or Sam doing this kind of presentation? Who should we ask to present this to that audience?
So the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side is actually, they formed a committee that is looking at similar questions recently. So I'm certain that something is going to come out from, the Sewer Authority Mid-Coast side directly on this. And I think, I mean, we are doing a number of outreach sessions, and this is really the first one on this. So hopefully we are reaching, this community by doing what we're doing, getting this into newsletters, for example, etc.
All right, I know I've got Harold and TJ, and then I have a question from Chad, but let's go to Harold first.
Yeah, hi, Harold speaking. Thank you for the presentation and overview, very educational. So I have a question about your mission. Are you basically talking about equitable price? And I understand, I mean, the picture that you paint today is really, we have aging equipment, the SAM treatment plant is with the climate, the global warming, probably needs to move inland, etc. But the other element that Anne alluded to is we have also significant growth as we look at, especially for Moss Beach. So we have Big Wave coming in, we have potentially Mid-Penn, we have a new hotel in Montara, and the county just presented Connect the Coast side. And what we're looking at just in Moss Beach is potentially 3 roundabouts on Highway 1, so on Cypress, California, and then 16th. And the question that I have here is, so I understand that we have high pressure water and sewer pipes running adjacent to Highway 1. There's a question if we would need these traffic measures without these big developments. But I understand that there's an implication on these water and sewer pipes that potentially need to be rerouted to accommodate 1 or 2 lane roundabouts. So there's a cost that will come with it. So is the community then asked to pay for these, or is that something the developers going to pay, or are there other sources? The other question is also the extension that's suggested in Connect the Coast side from Carlos Street to 16th. And when I bike there, I see there things like access boxes to the new sewer connection that basically was put in a few years ago on the Highway 1. So that needs to be moved. And is Montara Water and Sewer planning to basically hold the community in the existing ratepayer harmless? And will the developers be charged for that? And do you have an idea about the price for this?
Yeah, so we don't really have an idea about the price. I can tell you that the district spent well over $1 million on the 16th Street project about 2 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. So these are significant numbers. And when I spoke with the county people in charge, and that is very recently, they stated that the projects or that they actually plan to include the utility relocation cost into the full project cost, and that this is all intended to be paid not by ratepayer funds, but by essentially the funds that are paying for Connect the Coast side. What they also stated is that if there are now some of these conflicts, like the one that you're described, that during, I mean, nobody has really a proper set of plans. This is all conceptual yet. So when something like this arises during the planning phase, so I got the statement that then the roundabout would potentially be moved, or an alternative solution be implemented, or no solution be implemented. So there's some changes depending on what utility conflict they will find. All of this is supposed to be actually now written into the study. So they stated they would prepare an amendment that describes exactly that.
Yeah, I don't see it in Connect the Coast side. And then for Big Wave, for instance, I know that if I recall the number right, is that Big Wave committed 600K for a traffic light for Cyprus. And that's just a traffic light. That doesn't include any, if the sewer pipe needs to be rerouted, etc. So the question is really who's paying for that, and will we as ratepayers be surprised by some of that?
So the statement from the county is that no.
Okay. Okay, no, thank you.
Mhm.
I will mention, I know Greg said he could also comment on Connect the Coast side. I don't know if that's necessary. I think Clemens, you covered it quite a bit, but let's see. Okay. I think what I'll do is move on here. I know TJ, you had your hand up if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Allison. I'm struck by the fact that we're looking at very long term. This may be 50 years, as you mentioned in your introduction, Clemens. As we think about the long term and the developmental changes that are going to go on here, the legislative ones as have been talked about, and other requirements, it seems to me we ought to also be looking at another option, which is not very popular in some ways, but that's the whole question about full consolidation of our water and sewage treatment systems here on the coast. I know we're going to talk about water supply in 2 weeks, but we basically have these different entities. One of the options that was put forward on the charts was having our own separate sewage treatment system, kind of going back to that. I think we ought to also look at what would the benefits be, as well as the disbenefits of a regional consolidation of all of these systems, and could we actually come up with more flexibility, more ways of dealing with it, and more options and all that. I just think I know it may be unpopular with some people, but I think it ought to be part of what we look at if we're looking at this long-term scenario. Thank you.
I actually have a question for you, TJ. What alternatives come to mind that a larger group might be able to tackle that we wouldn't be able to consider on the smaller?
Well, some of them are going to be on water supply, so that's kind of more in 2 weeks' time. But we do have different types of water supply or water resources that we're using in the different CCWD versus MWSD and the like. Having a combined system might actually give us a lot more versatility or whatever. On the sewage side, we just talked about major potential changes being forced on us through legislation, which was in fact what happened, combination of legislation and other actions that created the need to change MWSD in the first place, and of course to buy the system. I'm not sure. We may have to relocate the SAM plant. If we relocate it and we serve the whole area and we do it in a thoughtful way as a broad coastside effort, may there be some other possibilities and some benefits of the way we do it. I just think it needs to be part of the discussion. I'm not advocating any particular solution, but I do think we are a coastside area. I feel like we ought to be dealing with more and more of these issues as a coastside together and not as separate entities.
Scott, real quick.
So I think if, Scott, did you mute yourself?
Rick wanted to comment.
Yeah, just real quick to TJ, this committee we formed, which is called the SAM 2040 Committee, is looking at both options. We will also be looking at refurbishing or relocating the SAM plant. One of the big questions is that we'll be looking at is all the technology is going towards smaller plants. One of the problems with a big plant is that we would continue to have a problem with the IPS. Smaller plants might even eliminate the need for an IPS. And that's the point of our entire lawsuit with Half Moon Bay, is Half Moon Bay says they don't want to pay for it. So that's thrown into the mix too. If we have a consolidated plant, if that's the direction we take, we still need to pump everything down to Half Moon Bay. And they've said they don't want to pay for it. So we're looking at all those options in the committee to see if, a bunch of smaller plants around can feed local needs easier. We're not pumping stuff all over the county up and down the coast. So all those are going to be discussed and looked at. So the big problem is the current plant is 40 years old, and moving it or rebuilding a big plant is really expensive too. So we'll be looking at both options, and then all the districts will look at the options and say, we want to put our money here or put the money there. So we're all going to be looking at that.
I do want to mention, because I don't want to forget, that JQ has a question. He raised his hand. So if we can move to JQ, you may have to unmute.
Okay. Yeah, again, I also wanted to thank the board for being progressive in their thinking here about these alternatives for the future. I think that's very good. I wonder a little bit though about the recycling initiatives for here. I mean, we don't have any big golf courses. We don't have any marshes or big marshes that I can think of just in the Montara Moss Beach area. So I would wonder how cost effective the recycling part would be for our small community. However, these modular units that you were talking about that would handle up to 250,000 gallons of sewage a day, I think look very interesting. And I would definitely encourage you to look more carefully into those, and especially if they eliminated the need for the IPS and made us even a little more independent, that would be awesome. So I would definitely encourage looking into that more. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for that statement, JQ. Of course, we would be happy if we would find someone who could pay for, portion of the recycled water. But in general, as Pippin mentioned, there's probably the idea that it needs to go to more than just one customer, if you so want, and an environmental use, is really. I think we have an ideal district for environmental use of recycled water. I do want to mention that the Pillar Point Marsh is the biggest marsh on the coast side. The entire airport was, until before the airport was built, just a marsh. And we also have actually in Montara a marsh upstream, just west of Montara Beach. So there's a number of very good, environmental uses that I think we see in the district.
Would the capacity of those marshes justify the cost, do you think, of the recycled water just for that use? And then you also have to consider that during high flow times during the winter that you wouldn't be able to pump as much water into there, or recycled water.
Yes, I mean, that is exactly. That's why it probably has to be a multitude, and that's what we all are, trying to discover, trying to, investigate and find out. I can see that the Pillar Point Marsh definitely could handle larger flows. It handled larger flows until it was ultimately, turned into an airport. So what is remaining, I'm pretty certain would benefit the marsh, benefit the harbor, for example, as well. We have to look at the flows. 200,000 gallons is much more than you can put in a tank, but it's also, it's still on the smaller side.
So I want to go back, Catherine, I see you, and Greg as well, raised hands. I wanted to go back to a couple of chatted questions so we don't lose track of them. One is on recycled water and just mentioning that clearly there's a seasonality to it. I think, Clemens, you mentioned that during wet periods when there's a quantity of sewage that could be treated is not the point in time when the end use or the irrigation use exists. Is there any discussion about the capacity for storing that water, storage during, basically periods when we could produce it, but then hold it? I don't know. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. For example, some of these retention ponds would essentially be could be some sort of this storage, if you so want. I mean, I just mentioned that, 200,000 gallons, if you want to fill up a 1,000,000-gallon tank, it goes very quick. And that tank is full and it needs to be used first. On the other end, if you, divide the 200,000 gallons per day by 1,440, the number of minutes per day, you're going to see that it's actually a relatively small trickle. So once again, I think, that is a flow that could be easily introduced into the environment, into potentially a creek, for example, without overwhelming, essentially the drainage system. Storing, we would have to look at some sort of pond, lake, with, a much larger volume than anything you can put in tanks.
One other question before I go to Catherine, because it was mentioned by chat quite a few minutes ago. Has Montara investigated other innovative processes that have been done in other communities or countries, and in considering cost and sustainability?
We do this all the time. And there's a number, if this is on the water side, for example, desalination is something that the district looked at extensively over a decade ago. We're continuously looking at new and evolving technologies. For the current discussion, current purpose, I think the package plants, the scalping plants, what we presented is really what we see worldwide, the sewer industry going. So as Rick also just mentioned, the idea that we had in the 70s to go to centralized plants, we see a reversion of that worldwide a little bit. And there is an understanding, and that may also address a little bit what JT was indicating. There is more and more an understanding that actually smaller plants, smaller jurisdictions ultimately are better able to protect the environment than larger agencies, larger plants can do that.
Great. Thank you. Catherine, why don't you go ahead, unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I just wanted to mention at $400 a foot, a mile of pipeline at today's cost is $2,100,000 plus. So if we have a lot of fixing to do with the SAM system to replace those pipelines, we're looking at huge costs at $14 million just between here and SAM. And so we are always looking at alternatives, and people are coming up with new alternatives. Our planning, the way I see it, speaking for me, is looking 40, 50 years out. And so what's most important from my point of view is what the community wants us to see, because the technology is going to change. But if the community wants us to preserve and protect our own local watersheds and our own local environmental needs and keep costs down, it has been proven that the old long lines are very expensive. With recycled water, they've stopped doing the purple pipes because of the cost, unless it's a huge water district. And so I would see, if we were going to be doing this recycled water, I would like to see us recharging the groundwater. We have an enormous number of individual wells in Montara and Moss Beach. The only agency that has been concerned about saltwater intrusion has been Montara Water and Sanitary, who has put in test wells. The county allowed wells and then didn't put in any test wells. So we need to take care of our local community first. And I think the other thing that we need to look at, and this would be working with Granada, and I think it makes sense, is the water quality problems in the harbor. And in looking at those old photos, as I mentioned, there used to be a lot more flow into the harbor, both before from freshwater, and then they put the breakwater in, and now it's a confined flow with with very little refreshing. Perhaps we could work with the state, with RCD, and with Granada and with the harbor district to be putting recycled water into the harbor to make it a better, through the marsh, to make it a multiple benefited project. But I think what we need from the community, because we are looking at so many years out, and I can guess not even the youngest of us will care much in 40 years, we need to have a solid basis for making the decision. And that's why I appreciate everyone who's here tonight and every single one of the questions. And that's why we're looking for more community meetings, and I invite everybody to, on Zoom, attend the SAM board meetings, attend the Montara meetings, and we really appreciate it when you spend your time and give us your opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I will mention that I had at least one chatted comment that said that yes, likes the idea of storage ponds for recycled water, especially if they're located in areas that would recharge the aquifer. Before we go to Greg, I know there were a couple of questions about describing the environmental benefits of putting recycled water into streams. I think Catherine covered that a little bit. So if anyone wants to, Clemens or Pippin, comment on that before Greg. And then I know, Greg, you can also speak here in a second. You should be able to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, another benefit to introducing water into the creek is creeks are ultimately the lowest points of, or is ultimately an aquifer that is visible. So creeks can de-water, but they also can actually replenish aquifers. So introducing water into creeks, one of the benefits would be during drier periods. That would also ultimately be recharging. It'd be similar to a pond, like some infiltration ponds, lakes or ponds without a bottom, where the water sits and the water then can infiltrate. A creek can do the exact same thing, for example. Other benefits, I think we mentioned, for example, the educational or bird habitat. Again, there has been a marsh in existence in Montara that is now very dry. That was not always the case. It's not necessarily natural. So we saw just a higher number of wetlands before we humans showed up and occupied the space and made changes to our environment. And we see this also worldwide in how recycled water is used. The majority is really these environmental uses with such benefits as establishing new habitats, for example. And Pippin, if you want to add to that, please feel free.
Sure, Clemens, thank you. I think you covered most of the points there, but I think that circles back to Greg's original question about, I think he mentioned AB 377. The goals of the state are really to rehabilitate all of California's surface waters statewide over the next 20, 30 years. And there are cases in several places in California. It's been discussed right here in my community about trying to improve the salmon run in Southern California and Central California, where there's some very dry and damaged creeks where the state is actually asking for communities to put recycled water or highly treated effluent into the creeks because it's better than no water at all. So there's various different ways that can be developed with that particular community's needs. For as that one watershed slide you put up, Clement, showed, there are lots of creeks in Montara, and perhaps in the past they've flowed more naturally before humans started paving and reconfiguring how water moves.
Great, thanks. I know, Greg, you've had your hand up, so if you'd like to.
Well, unfortunately, this raises another question. I got two. If you don't mind, at some point talking about how the environmental benefit gets turned into revenue, because I have a sneaky suspicion that we ratepayers are going to end up paying for this. But the other point, Catherine kind of stole it in a way. I'm aware there's a district up north, I think it's Sonoma, where they pump the recycled water uphill, put it back in their geysers. And I thought that was kind of an appealing idea, given that we're on a large aquifer here. But I'm also aware that 20% of the electricity cost in the state of California is the big lift pumping water into LA. So I'm a little concerned what the cost dynamics are. So I like Catherine's idea. I would love to see us be able to replenish our own hill. But I guess my question is first about the money side of things. How does an environmental benefit end up helping us pay for something, if at all?
So, well, Greg, what we're suggesting is to look exactly at what you're talking about. That is what we want to learn as well. We want to understand this too. There is always an option to combine an environmental use with a paying customer. So, for example, we understand there is interest in the school developing better play fields. That would be a potential use for recycled water. There's some ranches around here. There's some agriculture that could be interested in recycled water. So there could be there could be a financial gain or at least a contribution to this. But that is really what we're trying to find out, quite frankly.
Hey, Clemens, I also know during our discussions, there was a little bit of discussion of, we have a complicated system as it is. It requires pumping to move, to gather from low points and move it ultimately down to SAM. So you're paying some pumping as already. And when you consider recycled water or some type of potentially scalping plant, you do reduce some of the flow and ultimate cost of treatment down at SAM. Now, it doesn't eliminate, of course, the cost of construction, right? But it does, there are some of those combinations that, though you may not have a customer that's going to pay for 100% of what that new recycled water costs, you'll have some reconfigurations. Is that right?
Yeah, I think partially. I think recycled water requires a bit more energy to produce. So I think you're right. There is some pumping cost that would be saved. But I also think, Greg, it's really about what just Pippin also mentioned. If we have to go down this path in some form, because the legislator decides to do so, then this community is burdened with the additional cost. And for us now is really the question, well, where do we want to put that money? Do we want to put that money really here, or do we want to see a different solution? So I think for us, really, this is coming so close to the threat that, we have to take action in this direction is getting so close that, we have to consider the money option while we look at this and trying to develop some use. That's why we're starting the discussion early. And, we're open that we're at the very beginning of this process.
So I know that Rick had his hand up, but I also had two chatted questions. So I want to call on those. And I know also we're at it's after 8, so we'll want to get to the board as well. But let me just reference the question. So there was a question about in terms of wastewater discharge into, say, the creeks or groundwater, how are contaminants like hormones, pesticides, prescription drugs handled, as they could have an impact on wildlife, aquatic organisms, as well as humans? Of course, some of those substances don't degrade readily and some last for long periods of time. So can we speak to what that treatment level would be or the expectation?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the retention ponds, but I think Pippin is probably the better person to address this when it comes to the technical aspect.
Thank you, Clemens. That is, it's a very good question, and that is one of the big challenges that that is faced as we look at. I think this, community has a lot of opportunities, and there are different ways to go through this. Right now, a good comparison, just for the strict environmental benefit, is the recently revamped and reconstructed marshes at the Mount View Sanitary Plant in Martinez, California. They have one of the few marshes that's not just receiving and benefiting from treated effluent. Excuse me, it's a standard secondary treatment. It does not do tertiary. They don't use chlorine. They use UV light, and then they go through a series of ponds. And it's one of the few treatment plants which the ponds are actually permitted in their plant operation as process equipment. So they're essential to the plant. The plant would requires them as part of their process. And they go through a series of ponds, and as it moves through that process, the natural plants and the mud and the various things that are at the bottom of the ponds and the way things just have more time to settle, they further improve that water quality as Clemens pointed out with the name. They're considered polishing ponds. And they're approved by the state for bird habitat, and there's box turtles and various things like this have been reintroduced. So I think it does, there are many options that can improve this water quality. And if the requirements would need to be higher for certain applications, I think each case would require a completed analysis by the district to understand what those needs are, the retention times, what type of animals come into contact, and how soon. So that's a good question, and that's part of what would need to go into the planning for the details of how each process might look depending on where it's positioned. And as Clemens pointed out, both on the north end and the south end of the district, there are marsh opportunities, as well as the creeks, which have very porous type materials. And so depending on those locations, maybe different treatment processes might be included in that package system, whether it had, some water goes over pre-carbon filtration, like I mentioned, UV light, as opposed to using chemicals like chlorine for disinfection or alternatives.
Thank you. I think the other thing we had a question of where, since we mentioned marshes, and so we had a question of number of references to historic marsh in Montara, not of where one, and doesn't see one on top of a map from the 1800s. So I'm going to bring us back here, because I think Pillar Point here is one marsh, correct? And then I think Clemens, you were also mentioning there was a marsh. Where was it? Was it Montara?
Yeah, it's in the Canoff Creek watershed. It's ultimately also close to the Daffodil Creek Canyon, but so getting close to Daffodil Creek, yes, that watershed.
There's also the restoration area that's just north of Canoff and just to the east of Highway 1.
In here.
So go in. No, that's the bluff top. Go, yeah, right there. There's an area that you really can't hike. It's an area that was especially reestablished as part of mitigation for the tunnel project. So if you look closely, it looks pretty wild, but that was done on purpose. But it's got a big basin, and might be another area where water might well go. But we've got a richness of resources for where we might put things. Let me give it back to you, Allison.
Great, thank you. I do know, Rick, I think you were raising your hand. I don't know if it's something you want to speak to now. We'll come back to the board, of course.
Yeah, I just want to do just real quick on the cost things. First of all, everybody has to understand that we're spending 20% of the SAM budget. So that we're paying a ton of money right now to fix up SAM. And that fixes up all the pipes going into SAM. And we'll be looking at huge grants. There's a lot of grant possibilities for eliminating most of ocean outfall, which we'll be looking at. But one of the big things about restoring aquifers, if anybody in this audience has heard a favorable forecast for water in California, I've never heard it. Everybody's talking drought, drought, drought. And introducing more water into our own aquifers up here, feeding our wells and our community, we may need to do that. So it isn't like these are optional things and we're just doing it to be nice to the aquifers and the plants. This could be a big thing for Montara because we are totally independent. And everybody needs to remember that we bought this, 18 years ago or whatever it was. So this is the community water up here. So part of this program could be saving our water supply. That's it.
Which will be on March 3rd. Discussions to come. I know Catherine's raised her hand, but I did want to just call on Christine, the council, just to speak briefly about the limitations on rate setting for a special district, Prop 218, etc. Christine. Oh, are you muted, my dear? Hold on. See if we can find you. Try now. Christine, I have to scroll down. Maybe she stepped away. So let's see. I know I see that also Greg had his hand up, but Catherine, do you want to speak? Again, I do want to make sure we have time to go back to the board here in a moment. So go ahead.
I just wanted to briefly say that I wish I had a pointer, but we have several major earthquake faults running through our district. We've got the probability of sea level rise affecting the intertie pipeline right along the edge of Highway 1 in El Granada. We have the earthquake fault, now I've forgotten the name of it, that runs right along Pillar Point Marsh, and it's the Seal Cove fault, as a matter of fact, and we can all see all of the many of the geology effects of that when we walk down to the Marine Reserve. That was one of the reasons that I started looking 10, 15 years ago at these package treatment plants. A major earthquake, there was just a 7.3 in Japan in Fukushima. The nuclear power plant's okay. But we don't, our system is not engineered for 7.3 Richter scale shaking on this coast. So if we have smaller plants, it's easier for people to stay home and for our systems to continue running, as opposed to trying to get all of our waste treatment down into Half Moon Bay. And if we did have a major break, it would be a major environmental disaster for the ocean and the community. So that's one of the things that has entered into this thinking, and it hadn't been brought up until now, but I think everybody is aware of earthquakes here. We need to keep it in mind for our future system. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think Greg had his hand up, but I think he has covered what he needed according to chat. I did want to just mention, I know there was a little bit of mention to me that we should mention the limitations on rate setting for special district. So I'll just add here, and Christine could add if she needs to, but of course, as a special district, you're limited by Proposition 218. The rates need to be set for the cost of service, cost of delivery, and you can't be, that's a whole prescribed process. So I think just keeping that in mind, whenever we set rates, they will be based on the cost of what is there to serve the community. So I think that covered the question that came to me. And at this point, I think I could turn this back. Clemens, if you had any closing statements, but I think we could turn this back to the board to make final thoughts.
I want to thank everybody for participating, and hopefully you can stay for the board discussion. So with that, Scott, we're going to hand the word to you and for board discussion.
Okay, well,
And
let's, let
shall I
me,
close the slideshow as well?
yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go around, call on each of you and comments and questions that you might have. How about we start with Peter?
Oh, let me make sure he can be heard. Hold on. Okay, so Peter, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes. I am, when I joined the board, I was very much interested in how SAM would develop over time, cost-wise. And as now the treasurer, I'm very aware of the cost of our system and how we manage those costs. And we have, after making some improvements in the reporting, we are now on the road of getting full transparency in both the cost of SAM going forward, as well as the cost of the Montara Water and Sanitary District. And I want all the participants this evening to be very much aware of how we are trying to control those costs, because more than anything else, we want the cost for water and sewage to be equitable and to only do that to control them to the point that we know exactly what's going on, and we try to avoid a situation where we have to increase both the sewage and the water rates permanently. We do it in very careful steps. We are also controlled by legislation, and we keep a good eye on the developments. I'm so glad that we have many participants, as many as 24 this evening, and I'm very grateful for their comments.
Thank you, Peter. How about you, Jim?
Yeah, as Clemens and others pointed out, it's really complicated to get our sewer up to the plant in Half Moon Bay. Complicated for cost reasons, environmental reasons, political reasons, and other reasons. It's very complicated. So it's really crucial, as Pippin and Clemens and others pointed out, that we have to be looking at alternative ways of treating our sewer, and we have to do it, look at local ways of doing it. And I think that it's, we have the land, we have the tank behind the district office, we have the space to do it, the place to do it. So I think it's really crucial that we continue on developing these plans, and it's just important that we do this. So I'm really thankful to the staff, the other board members, and the people in the audience for participating. And I think we should keep going forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jim. How about you, Rick?
Just some quick comments. We had last Friday a second meeting of our little 2040 committee. We had a massive time conflict from Half Moon Bay, so realistically it was only about a 15-minute meeting. But we did reiterate at Half Moon Bay's request that we do analyze what the costs of either refurbishing or relocating SAM will be as part of this committee, which we will do. As everybody has said, I'm going to just keep reiterating the point. With a bunch of little plants moving around the coast side, transportation costs go way down. I don't know what the vision could be to when Half Moon Bay has said they don't think they should pay for anything north of the border. That essentially isolates us. We could keep subsidizing Half Moon Bay through a major plant, but until we see the outcome of this lawsuit and if their attitude changes, if we're going to have to pay for everything up here anyway, I think that would be an indication that these small plants might be a great consideration. And like we've said many times, we need the water in our aquifer and stuff like that. So I've said everything else earlier, so I'll pass.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. I want to reiterate, thank you to everybody for attending and listening in tonight. Greg asked a question about if other agencies could do the same kind of meeting. I would just suggest that if you want them to pay attention, send them to our website where they'll be able to watch this. This is a very thorough discussion. I'm very proud of our staff. And because this has been so well done. I want to say that in October, the end of October last year, there was a consultant hired by the board at SAM who gave the 3 general managers a capital improvement program estimate that Half Moon Bay had been asking for. And it was looking at maintaining the plant and bringing it not even necessarily up to current standards, but just to keep it from breaking and doing some minor improvements. And so for a 5 to 10 year program, we were looking at $65 million. That's a lot of money. If Montara were to take our 15 to 17 million dollars, and that's today's dollars, we could do a whole lot up here. That's why we're coming to the community and asking for your opinion and your involvement in this. There's lots of ways to spend a dollar, but Bob Patasek, who was on the board for so many years and such an excellent board member, always said there's a great old German saying, you can only spend a penny once. And we're talking about your pennies, and we only want to spend them once. We don't want to have to ask you for more pennies to redo more work. So that's the philosophy of the board. But yes, that's part of what created this is the $65 million. I look forward to hearing from you. My email is catherine@mwsd.net. And I'd be happy to, as you can see, talk to anybody for any length of time. Thanks again.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I'll try to go quickly so we can wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just a few thoughts that came to me as I was taking in all of the comments and questions. And thank you so much for these. These have been some really thoughtful questions and comments. And we're so glad that you're here and participating. Keep them coming. We obviously have some things to think about here for quite a while. Greg asked the question about how does environmental benefit lead to revenue? And I'm just going to be really frank. It may not. But as we've all discussed, we have expenses in front of us. And Greg, you always like to talk about your educational background. Let me throw out something about my framework for how I'm considering these options. In operations research, you take a whole bunch of variables, a whole bunch of constraint equations, and you create an objective function where you try to find the best combination of all the variables to give you the best outcome on the thing that you're trying to optimize. As Rick pointed out, if we had a number of small boxes that were doing treatment, they might be able to discharge with gravity and no pumps for much of the discharge that we do. We right now have 13 pump stations and 21 grinder pumps. Anything we can do to no longer need one of those pumps saves us the capital expense of replacing that pump when it eventually wears out, the daily maintenance on that pump, the PG&E that we spend to operate that pump, the staff time that it takes to, all of these costs. So every one of these things that we've got all these pieces on the chessboard. We're going to look at, okay, how can we arrange these pieces so that we get something where in the end, we've got something better than if we just continue with the status quo. I'm grateful that Rick has been leading the effort to get people together at SAM and think about what SAM, as actually the only consolidated body on the coast side. People talk about consolidation all the time. We've been doing that for 40 years with SAM, with Grenada, Montara, and Half Moon Bay. So the consolidated body is considering what options the consolidated body has. Montara is doing the same thing. So we're looking at what can we do together, what can we do on our own, and if our partners want to borrow from some of the work that we're investigating, and they get some ideas from this, and we each do things that are informed by the research and experiments of the others, that's fantastic. So I'm looking at things like the wastewater that we're treating as a resource. Remember, it's a resource. Down at the bottom of it, it's water, and that's valuable stuff. We have to spend money on it to clean it up. We have to spend money on it to send it somewhere. So we're going to look at what set of combinations get us the best treatment for that water, the best treatment for our environment, and the best treatment for our community's wallet. Keep in mind that it was mentioned early in the presentation that more stringent requirements are coming down the road for water treatment. So this is a forcing function that's driving, we're going to have to spend it somewhere. So that's a big thing underneath, but don't forget that part, because that's a moving piece that we don't control. That's just the inevitable boulder coming down the mountain, and we want to get ready for that. One last technical point, when we talk about flow, if we're doing package plants of our own and we're treating 200,000 gallons of water a day during the dry weather season where it's not raining, we're treating more when it is raining. When we're doing treatment with a package plant, the level of treatment has a lot to do with what you intend to do with that water for discharge. If you're going to give it to, say, for example, rocket farms for a nursery, you have to treat it really well. And then they're going to have to treat it some more because they're going to put it on things like orchids. And they can't just take random water. They have to finish the water. If we're doing discharge, like Pippin talked about, to open bodies of water that can act as a finishing stage in nature, we don't have to spend so much time and money on what happens inside the package plant. Those things have multiple stages, and you don't need to finish everything out to get that quality that you might sell to someone doing open irrigation. There's a lot of knobs on this that we can adjust. So when we're thinking about the flows, the dry weather, the wet weather, these are the kinds of things that folks like Pippin are actually very, very good at. And keep asking the questions. We'll have more information on this as we develop some of the ideas and as you have more questions for us. I'm gonna stop there and just thank you all for joining us tonight. How we care for the community is a lot more enjoyable when the community participates. And as you have questions, as you have concerns, please reach out to us. I think we're all open to talking to you. And I think Clemens, am I right? We're all our first name at MWSD.net.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, terrific. So hopefully we'll hear from some of you. And until next time, we do have another meeting tomorrow night. So if something occurs to you overnight, come on by and bring us an open session comment. And with that, if I hear no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.